And we'll go live over there. And now we'll let people in. Hi, everyone on YouTube. Welcome to Pure Presence Book Study with your hosts, Jenny Beal and Bill Free. And welcome everyone in the room. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Let me see where that Facebook Live is so I can make sure I turn the sound off. Okay, it's off. Looks like it's. I wonder how come it's on sometimes and it's off on other times. I don't get that. Hi everyone, welcome to our book study. It's so great to have you here today, and thank you for joining us. Jenny, I'm going to make you the co-host so that you can catch people if I get to talking. And we're looking at, I made a mistake on the notification. I put that we're on chapter 10. We're actually still on chapter 9, about page 140, about 140. We're on chapter 9, and so I'll change that in the notification that goes out for the replay. And thank you for joining with us today. Jenny, sorry for the error in the page number. Where would you like to start on chapter where we left off for chapter 9?
Well, let's start with the question about not being the doer, because this is a teaching which comes into an awful lot of traditions. But Francis's response to this question is really very interesting, because he says the understanding I am not the doer is on the negative side. It's what I am not, and it leaves one in a state of resignation. And he goes on to explain that this understanding doesn't lead to happiness, because happiness comes from the experience of what I am, not from the understanding of what I am not. And he explains that from the scientific and particularly the materialist point of view, then actually it's very clear that we're not the doer. So this doesn't only relate to a spiritual teaching. He says that scientific viewpoint says that mind is a product of the body, and the body is a product of the universe, and the universe operates according to the universal laws or patterns. So from that scientific point of view, any action undertaken by the body is governed by the laws of the universe, and so really only the universe acts. And it seems to be one of those paradoxes that we can't do anything, but yet we have this sense of freedom, and we've talked about that in relation to a previous chapter. We feel that we can choose and that we can do. So what actually happens, what the mind does, is that immediately after a decision or a choice has been made or an action taken, the mind jumps in to claim, I chose that, or I decided that. But that's what Jean Klein calls the clown taking the bow after the ballerina has finished her performance.
Right. What's interesting about this whole idea, and my going into chapter 10 caused me to look ahead a little bit. And so I'm happy to report that we'll continue this idea about who the doer is, and the idea of choice and the paradox of it, because it seems like, and even when you just said it, it sounded like a choice is made, when it's actually what chapter 10 takes us into, which is a choice is really not a choice. It's the flow of the universe. It's the flow of what would be called the divine or universal intelligence or whatever you want to call it. The Christians would call it God, and we call it God also, but it's not really a God. But we think of that spontaneous non-choice as a choice, right?
Yes, we conceptualize it as a choice. And when he spoke about freedom earlier on in the book, he talked about freedom from, which is liberation, but he also talked about freedom to. And freedom to he described as freedom to create, but there's no separate entity which actually creates. And in fact, there's as you say, there is no choice. There's just an unfolding, and that unfolding happens according to the patterns of nature. And it is, yes, just a flow. And it's interesting that even in neuroscience, it's been demonstrated that apparent choice was made. We think we make a choice, but before the mind knew anything about it. So the mind came in afterwards and said, "Oh, I made that choice."
Yes,
and they,
yes.
they can actually show that by looking at fMRI scans, which is very interesting.
Well, just to digress for just a moment, for you that came in later after we started, I posted in the notification the wrong chapter. We're not on chapter 10. We're on page 140 of chapter 9 still, and we'll finish up at page 145. And going back to that, Jenny, I'm intrigued with the idea that the speed by which the mind takes the bow, or the clown takes the bow, is it has a reverse effect also, where the mind seems to be very fast to go in there and and cause problems. The mind. I remember when years ago, Lisa and I, when we were at the beginning of our relationship, we would I'd be having a conversation with Lisa, and the something would come out of my mouth that I immediately wish I could put back in my mouth. And I remember saying to Lisa one time, I said something sarcastic to her, and I said, and then I saw that I did, and I said, "Did you see that?" He said, "Yeah, I saw that." But it was like something seemingly got in front of uh, sensible, not being, just being kind. Something got in front of that and
But
seemed
that
to be
was the
first.
universe. That's just the universe acting. It just chose to make that type of comment at that time, and then the mind comes in and say, "Wow, did I really make that comment?"
Oh, so are you saying that the universe is sarcastic?
Oh, absolutely. It can be very sarcastic. Yes.
Oh,
All of this, you see, it's not. Sometimes we think, oh, the mind, the consciousness is good and the mind is bad, but it's not really like that. Everything that arises, that we perceive, everything comes from the universe, whether it's and that's everything we perceive coming out of our mouths, and that can be very, very nice things, or it can be very nasty things. All of our thoughts come from the universe, and some of them are very kind and loving thoughts, and others might be really quite uncharitable thoughts. But they're not ours. They don't belong to a separate mind or a separate entity. They all come from the universe. So there's
Well, this
no sort of personal involvement in it, because there is no person.
this is a very interesting conversation. I apologize for everyone that we're digressing from the content of the chapter, but this is interesting, Jenny, because it seems like a comment that would that would be sarcastic. It seems like a comment that would be coming from hate rather than love is a comment or an idea that would be coming from a separate self.
Yes, but all a separate self is a creation of the cosmos. The separate self is really only a thought. It's not an entity which actually exists. It's a label we give to a thought. I am separate, which arises in the moment. So we talk about some actions and behaviors as coming via a separate self, but really that's a kind of lower understanding in a way. All of it comes from the universe, but because there are patterns in the universe and the way the universe unfolds, then some of those patterns are related to ignorance. Francis describes it as ignorance. He doesn't tend to like using the term separate self very much. And so he talks about consciousness playing the game of ignorance. He says it's not something that a separate entity does. Consciousness just decides out of its freedom to play the game of ignorance. And there's a Sanskrit word, lila, which means play. And that's really what it's referring to, is that concept of play. And it's quite hard for our minds to get around that concept, because we like to think of consciousness as being this all loving, all kind, all beautiful, eternal, infinite being. But everything, all of the ignorant actions in the world come from consciousness, and they're made out of consciousness, the reality of the universe. And it's so there's what that does is it takes a huge weight off our shoulders, because there's no I that is responsible for those things. We notice, and we notice that what we said was really not very nice, and that noticing also comes from consciousness, and that's consciousness suddenly stopping playing the game of ignorance and plays the game of remembering, which is very beautiful.
Well, it is. I mean, it's beautiful until someone dies. It's that someone gets murdered. It's beautiful
Yes.
until someone is ugly to another being. Well, I guess another person that is a being. It just doesn't seem. I like the idea of ignorance being a sort of a miscreation. So this is really good content. I finally have something to formulate a question for Rupert and Francis. I've been looking for a question for a long time. This is a really good thing. I hope I can talk to Rupert. I'm going to interview Rupert on June the 4th on a Facebook Live, and we're going to talk about his new book, I Am. And maybe, I don't know if it'll fit into his I Am series because, or his meditation series, but I'm definitely going to formulate a question out of this dialogue. Or I'll jump over and have the conversation with Francis because I've rarely had formulated a question for Francis in any of the venues that we've had with his involvement. So
Yes, well, he runs satsangs nowadays it's on Tuesdays and Thursdays where you can go on live and ask questions.
yeah,
The weekend ones nowadays are just meetings at his house, so it's a bit harder to ask questions. But Tuesdays and Thursdays you can go and ask a question of Francis, and that, as you say, yes, that's a good one. It's something he's talked about a number of times recently, but you would have a different take on that, which would I think would be interesting for everyone.
yeah. But the wheels are turning to formulate a question. So I'll look forward to doing that. And I'll send a notice out to everyone if you would like to join. And let's look at where to finish up this chapter 9. When we look on page 140, it says the mind wants to know but cannot. So
Yeah.
well, I don't want to keep going into that same scenario. When the mind, Francis says, when the mind knows that it cannot know, it becomes silent. So wouldn't that be the same thing when the mind is involved?
The mind is really the agency through which the activity of consciousness, so that's thoughts,
Yeah.
feelings, perceptions, all arise. So the mind is that agency, and obviously speaking, then that's first very quickly there's a thought formulated, and that's done through the agency of mind. So that's really
So
what mind is. But in a sense, Francis says in a way that mind doesn't really exist. It's just it's a kind of label that we give to the flow of experience as it flows from moment to moment.
right, right. So in my mind, and this is where I'm coming from, in my mind, when you're in flow, when you're in a divine flow, you're in harmony with all that is. You're in the natural state of harmony. So there's not this resistance and preferences and distinctions and separate ideas involved. There's divine flow that is it's in flow for the current to be unrestricted, unresisted.
Exactly, and that's when you're not in ignorance. He sometimes has described it as being like surfing the waves. So you're on this surfboard, and then you get this natural flow, and you're going with the waves. But sometimes you just fall off the surfboard, and that's when you fall into ignorance, and that's when you say things that later you might, when you get back on the surfboard, you regret.
My point. That's my point. Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
So
yes, but
yeah.
it's not, there's no you that does that. It's not all of that, the falling in the water, the surfing on the surfboard, all of it is the play of universal consciousness. It's there's no person that takes that adopts ignorance. Ignorance is just a play of consciousness, the falling off the surfboard at that moment. You have no control over that. It
Okay,
happens.
so Jenny, I'm going to take this. I'm going to take this one more step, right? So that sarcasm that I shared with my wife, Lisa, felt falling off the surfboard.
Yeah.
Did you catch that? I'm sorry is a way of getting back up on the surfboard.
Well, exactly. Yes. Yes.
All right, we're on the same
So
page.
it was marvelous. You got straight back on the surfboard, and
Yeah,
that was
right.
that was fine. But that wasn't your choice. That just happened, and that was universal consciousness playing
Yeah,
a game.
yeah. Well, it sounds like, I mean, this is my experience. The better I understand consciousness, the better I understand the presence and the way the game flows and plays, the more the least I spend time off the surfboard, and the more I find my experience to be one of harmony, flow, and peace.
Yeah, yes, that's right, and that's just an unfolding pattern as well.
Yeah,
And one of the influences on that pattern is when we get together like this and we talk about these things, because that patterns are really repetition. They come from repetition. And so the more those ideas get repeated, the more they predominate. And so that
yeah,
that predominance keeps you on the surfboard for longer.
yeah, yeah. So the questioner here on page 140 says, could you speak of not being the doer? And that really is the paradox. It's not being the doer. However, there is an engagement, there is an involvement.
Yes, there's consciousness, consciousness acting or appearing to
Yeah.
act. It's a movement of consciousness.
Yeah. It's an activity that spontaneously it seems to go from ignorance to non-ignorance. It seems to go. It's almost like a self-corrective device.
Yes, to some extent.
Right.
It can be self-corrective. Yes, I think once you've had a glimpse of your true nature, so that's somehow that brings about a change in the body mind, and that then is always available in a way. So there's always this kind of pull back. So you always notice you're in the water and get back on the surfboard rather than staying floundering around in the water for too long.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. But what's interesting is that about this question is that it's often regarded, the idea you are not the doer, as being really the core of the this or part of the core of the spiritual teaching. But what he's explaining is, well, not really, because first of all, it's obvious from the scientific point of view, and then he goes on later and he says the understanding I'm not the doer does not logically imply that consciousness is universal, that my experience of I am, of being, is universal and eternal. And he says, I don't see how there can be happiness under those circumstances. There can be some peace with resignation, but certainly not true celebration. And true celebration comes from the good news that there is no death, and from the deep feeling that what I am is eternal, not from the intellectual and dry understanding that there is nothing that I can do.
Yeah. Well, that also seems to imply a distinction.
Yes, yes. There's there is a distinction, so that the real understanding is that glimpse of our true nature, of eternity,
Yeah.
of limitlessness.
Yeah.
And he says that if as a result of that we reach the understanding, I am not this tiny little doer, then that's different, because then we're understanding that we're not the limited entity that we previously imagined ourselves to be, which laid claim to, as the clown, which laid claim to all the doings of the body mind.
Right. Right.
But he
Ultimately, it is the one. There's only one being. Ultimately,
yes,
there's only consciousness.
exactly, that there's
Yeah.
no separate little entity.
Yeah.
But he goes on to explain that for pedagogical reasons, it may be useful to tell someone you are not the doer and ask them, why, what are you trying to achieve? It doesn't make any sense since there's no doer. And in the cessation of effort that follows, there will be a window of opportunity for a glimpse of our true nature. And it's the lack of effort and effortlessness is very much a key part of Francis's teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. And that moves it from the idea that there is a separate self to to the understanding that there is effort is not required when being.
Yes, and that understanding comes from beyond the mind. Understanding, as in the previous part of this chapter, he explains that understanding really comes from intelligence. It's a natural attribute of consciousness, and it's beyond the mind, and it's beyond space and time also, for that same reason. So once we've had that understanding, then we may forget it, and we often will, but it's always there and it's always available, and that's the important thing. And
Right.
otherwise, you're going to drown in the ocean instead of getting back on the board.
Melissa said, I am not the doer as ego, but I am is always the doer as infinite reality, awareness, which is all there is to do anything.
Yes, that's one way of expressing it. I challenged Francis on that a little while ago, and he admitted that actually there was no doer, because I said I felt that that there were no choices being made. There was no chooser. There was therefore no doer. There was just an unfolding according to the patterns of the cosmos. And
Wow.
he agreed with that. So that's but I think it's okay to conceptualize as a doer, as long as it is a cosmic doer. But in reality, I somehow a doer implies time,
Yeah.
and really at the level of consciousness there is no time.
Yeah, yeah. This is a tough one because I mean,
Yeah.
I've got arguments going all over the place right now as far as taking another side of that idea that something if consciousness jumps off the board, then jumps back on the board, and of course that's true at the ultimate level, but what is it, as one that is ignoring infinite intelligence, there seems to be another energy that that's in cause, and there's something that takes you off the surfboard, and there's something that puts you back on, and ultimately it's the same thing. But would you have fallen? Would you have jumped off the surfboard if you hadn't perceived yourself to be separate?
Well, no, the forgetting. It's really a forgetting, because the surfing only happens after the glimpse, really. So it's a forgetting, and that just happens, and that is the falling off, is the forgetting itself. But there is no person that forgets. There's no entity that forgets.
Right.
You could think of forgetting as being just like a state. For example, a state in an electric circuit, where whether the gate is open or whether the gate is closed. It's something that's really very neutral. We think of ignorance because from the perspective of an imagined human entity, then ignorance seems bad. And of course it seems bad because it's associated with suffering. So human body minds are not that keen on suffering. So it appears bad. But at the absolute level, there is no good or bad, and ignorance is just this perfectly neutral game.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Andrea said something that's kind of funny. Just congratulate yourself for climbing back on the surfboard.
That's very, very, very good. Yes,
Yeah, very
absolutely,
good. Yeah, thank you.
absolutely. Yes, congratulate. Yes, yourself, me consciousness, not
Yeah,
me,
yeah.
a separate entity, of course.
Well, in the throw of that scenario, that was hilarious because it was like this thing came out of my mouth, and I went, "Did you see that?" It's like busted, It was like,
Yeah.
but it did fall, it did lose its flavor of creating chaos.
Yeah, yes, and it's if every time there's that kind of remembering which follows on from an incident like that, then somehow that starts to change the patterns. You see, the patterns evolve. The patterns aren't fixed. The universe is not completely predetermined. He sometimes describes it in terms of physics and Schrodinger's cat, and that's the cat in the box, which may be alive or maybe dead, and both possibilities are there, but at some point there's a collapse of the wave possibility into the wave function into one possibility, and the
Yeah.
cat is either alive or dead. And so all the time he's saying all the time that there are these possibilities, and that's the freedom. That when he talks about freedom, and when I spoke about the freedom not being a freedom to choose or to do, he said yes, the freedom is really like the collapse onto one particular possibility out of all the possibilities that are there within infinite consciousness. So as someone who loves science, that explanation appealed to me very much.
Yeah. Audrey said there is no surfboard. And Catherine says we're not what happened 5 seconds ago, nor who we think we will happen 5 seconds from now. And Zachary says even what would be judged as the worst evils, Hitler, etc., is done by universal consciousness. Can you comment on this?
It is part of the unfolding of infinite consciousness. There have been not just Hitler, but right throughout the whole of history. You know, there have been really terrible, from the human perspective, really terrible atrocities that have occurred. But and this is what such a hard thing to really get our minds around.
Yeah.
But from the point of view of infinite consciousness, that is just the play. That is just Leela.
Yeah.
And it's a play that relates to ignorance. All of those atrocities all arose through a kind of predominance, a pattern of ignorance, which was predominant at that time within those particular body minds. So sometimes it's one body mind, in the case of Hitler influencing many others, or sometimes it's a whole group of body minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this would be a good question for Rupert or Francis. Shannon, why would consciousness play in the Holocaust? And I mean, it's a play.
It's the why question can't be answered. It happens. What unfolds unfolds.
Yeah.
And there's no God choosing. There's no ultimate being that is choosing the Holocaust, and that was really part of my point to Francis when I talked about the ultimate chooser, and I felt that there wasn't one. It's not like that. It is just a flow of energies.
Yeah.
And there are different energies, just like, you know, there are different colors in the world. We have black and white and all the colors in between. There are many different colors that we see around us, and it's similar to that. It's patterns. From the point of view of consciousness, it's like patterns of color.
Yeah, I like the idea very much that there's no God doing anything. I like the idea very much that it's really frequencies. There are wave patterns, and I also like the idea that the wave patterns are really relative to the experience, and that what what consciousness truly is untouched by all of these activities.
Yes, because the activities aren't separate from consciousness. The activities are the play of energy of consciousness. If you think of consciousness as consciousness in motion, as being a play of energies, and then consciousness at rest is just complete peace and no movement at all. So it's really like that.
Yeah. Well, let's keep going. We have a few more pages we can look at. There's another question on page 142. What is transmitted by a spiritual friend?
Yes, that's very beautiful. there was I quoted the whole of his answer here in a thread on my Facebook page. People were talking about the relationship with someone who has dementia. So, like, maybe a parent or a close friend who develops dementia, and the difficulties of communicating with them, and whether this teaching could help in any way. That was really the question. And this answer here seemed to be the perfect answer to how this teaching can help, because I mean, it helps, I think, in all relationships. It's about all kinds of friends, but in particular, if you're dealing with someone who has dementia, then ordinary words, they cease to work, because they're not really understood. The mind isn't working very well, and it's really that kind of silent transmission which helps. And I know that from some years ago, my mother had Alzheimer's, and a lot of our communication, particularly towards the end, there were almost no words, but there was being together. And when I was with her, then you could see the smiling, and it was lovely.
So you had a felt experience,
Yes,
without using words.
Absolutely. For me, it was quite a difficult time, because I had a choice to make. She had been very badly mistreated in a mental hospital. She'd been sectioned and put in a mental hospital, and they'd not taken care of her. She fell down, broke her leg, got a serious bronchitis, and the consultant said to me, "Look, we can just let her die now. She's got Alzheimer's, or we can mend the broken hip." And I stayed with her all night, and we didn't talk about anything like that. We didn't talk about that choice, because it was not one that she was able to make in words, but there was a choice, and there was a choice to go on living, which was very, very interesting. The words that she uttered didn't make a lot of sense, but related to an experience which she wanted to have again, which was to come and have tea with me at my house and things. And it was just clear from that she didn't want to die at that time. Mm-hmm. So it's very powerful. It's I learned a huge amount from her, and that experience about that silent communication.
Yeah. It sounds like this scenario on page 143 that Francis speaks about with the child waking up with dreams or nightmares. And then
Yes.
just holding the child, and that sense of that communication, that quiet, silent communication has a transmission. And I actually don't think, in fact, the Course in Miracles points to, and I think Rupert does also, that points to the idea that just the presence of awareness, and then bringing someone that is remote, bringing that individual into this experience of awareness is a kind of a communication that occurs. Even doesn't even have to be on the same continent. I don't think it even has to be in time.
Yes, I think it was really since that experience, I've always thought of words as being much more a tuning in mechanism to tune in, just like an old-fashioned radio when you turn the dial to tune to a program. And I feel that words are more like that. They're a way of tuning into the transmission, which can always be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's see. It looks like do we have any questions? There were comments on the board, and I think we have finished. Have
Well,
we
no,
come
we
to the
haven't
end?
done this. We haven't looked at the question, what is Sahaja Samadhi, which is sort of
Oh,
quite
okay. Okay, good.
an important question, really.
What is sahaja? And I think sahaja means the natural state, right?
Yes, that's right.
What is
So,
sahaja, or the natural state of samadhi?
yes, and he starts by explaining first Nirvikalpa Samadhi, because that's the state that on this path we tend to experience first. It describes it as the experience of our true nature, and it's sometimes called consciousness without objects. The sort of Western traditions, that's what it's called. So it's an experience of pure consciousness, and it's very often accompanied by bliss, but it's really an artificial state, and in the Indian traditions it's seen as the goal or end point of meditation. So you sink below all the thoughts and sensations and perceptions. You go into the silence and the emptiness of myself. And it's like sort of sinking down to the bottom of the ocean. And Rupert sometimes quotes the beautiful Rumi poem, "Flow down and down and down in always widening rings of being." And so Nirvikalpa Samadhi's really just a temporary state of the mind, but it's a state in which our true nature is very apparent, and that's usually where the first glimpse will come from. And
Yeah.
when we've experienced that, then to go back to it, and we go back into meditation. And so he explains that whenever we come out of meditation and engage with the world, there's always this longing to go back to the peace and the stillness of Nirvikalpa Samadhi.
Right. Yeah. You know, that experience of resting in awareness, resting in presence, and I think this is part and parcel to that, because when one finds themselves establishing or abiding in that place, you emerge in a different personality.
Yes, you bring back some of that bliss with you, and Francis points out that our desire always to go back to that stillness, to go and sit down and sink below all the objects of experience. That desire actually comes from duality, because we're making a distinction between nirvana, which is pure consciousness, and samsara, which is the world. And he says, well, you need to take another step, and this next step is sahaja samadhi. And to do that, then more inquiry is needed. And so he says, from where does the world arise? We ask ourselves, from where does the world arise? Where does it abide, and where does it go? And the answer is obviously consciousness, because that's the answer that we've learned. from abiding in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But then there's the obvious question, well, why are you looking for Nirvikalpa Samadhi if everything is consciousness? So just stay at rest wherever you are. And when that has really sunk in, then we realize, as he says, that everything is God or everything is myself. And there's nothing other than God, nothing other than myself. And that is Sahaja Samadhi, and it stays with us through all our activities. And one of the characteristics of that state is that the fear of death, which is what prevents us being happy, then disappears permanently.
It is a kind of a paradox in that there's no choice, and yet, and it almost seems a little dualistic in that there are preferences that one would abide versus not abide, that one would that there's a seeming better state of samadhi or of quiet presence. There's a seeming better state of abiding versus not abiding. So there's a paradox of you know what I mean?
Yes, the way I think of it is, you know, if you're thirsty, I mean, suddenly you have this thought arises, oh, I'm thirsty, and then you go and get a glass of water, and it's a similar thing. You suddenly realize this is at that earlier stage. Oh, I want to go back to abiding as presence, and then you sit down, you go into the silence, go into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but then after a while, you realize that there's no need to do that, and it's like having your glass of water with you all the time. Whenever you're thirsty, you're drinking out of it, irrespective of anything else that you might be doing at the same time.
Yeah. It says that last paragraph of that section says sometimes we can clearly see a point of no return, but it is not always like that. However, the deep fear of disappearing, the deep fear of death doesn't come back. This deep fear is what prevents us from being happy. When it disappears, a search becomes a celebration.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a question on the board, is Nirvikalpa Samadhi still considered a state? And yes, it is a state. And Francis has described it as, and I think Atmananda also, as an artificial state, because it's a state which is produced by meditation, by a technique of meditation. And if you think back to chapter 2, when we talked about the gaps, and I think if you look at page 29, and there's the question, how should we approach the small I when it returns? And he says, so that's how do we approach the ignorance when it comes back? We simply return to the understanding that it appears in the real I. The thoughts that relate to the small I will gradually subside. Don't replace them with anything. There will now be gaps in our experience that were formerly occupied by the thoughts and the feelings of the small I. And later we recognize these gaps as our original openness. And I think we talked at the time about really the idea of extending the gaps, that the gaps naturally do extend, That's one of the techniques was explained in the Tripura Rahasya. That if we use those gaps, if we extend them and rest in those gaps, then no other type of samadhi, like Nirvikapa samadhi, needs to attract us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, it is. It is refreshing to have to have remedies for logging into the attention of the mind and losing oneself for too long in that experience.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Elizabeth said there is energy that flows in waves, patterns. We consciousness want to be in charge of this, the holy and worthy. We consciousness find it hard to understand this. Yes, it definitely happens over here.
Yes, the mind finds it hard to understand for consciousness. It's natural, and that is the natural state. Is the understanding of that, and it's the sense of that as we as our body minds move through space and time.
Yeah, and it's the release from suffering,
Yes.
where consciousness seemingly loses itself, or from ignoring itself, it finds itself identifying as the body mind, as the bodysuit, as a separate self. And there is great freedom in realizing that that this is a paradox, experience, and none of this is really a permanent or all-encompassing experience.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. Rick says, in the end, even states are illusory. Yes. Yes. And then Catherine says, after I got that, everything changed. Yes. Yes, that's what brings us back to these conversations, as we'll see from chapter 10. Chapter 10 is living in the flow. That's not the name of it, but chapter 10 is called Objects Flow Through Us. And Francis gives some really great ideas and some references to these exact questions. I'm looking forward to jumping into one of Francis's study groups. I get the emails. I'm going to jump in there and formulate a question and see where it goes.
I'll
Yeah, I'm
look
looking
forward to
forward to
hearing
that.
his answers.
Yeah. And for some of you that came late, I'll put a link in for the Facebook Live with Rupert. He and I are going to have a Facebook Live introducing his new book, his new meditation series on called I Am. And then he has another book that's coming out that is called Being Myself. And we're going to give announcement to that on June 4th. And I'm just going to grab a link real quick and put it in the chat so you can save it. Where to see that on June 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Let me just share that with you in the chat. Here's the link right there. And oh no, that's not going to be it. That's not the right one. Forgive me. That's the wrong link, because we're not going to be in the Teachers of God. We're going to be in A Course in Miracles. Let me give you this link. You'll never find it if I don't give it to you. So this is going to be on June 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern. It's this one. Let me see if I can find it. Right here. There it is. It's in a Course in Miracles group. It's a huge group, 429,000 people are in that. My recommendation to Rupert to put it out to a group that doesn't know him that well. And it will also be communicated to all of Rupert's people through his email. So you'll get notification from Rupert of the Facebook Live on June 4th. And we'll be looking at chapter 10 here next week on Tuesday. Objects flow through us, page 145. I'll send a replay out to everyone in a few minutes. And thank you for being here. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone. Lovely to be here as always.
Thank you. I hear the bird in the background.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye, everyone.